Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most read, one of the most favorite, and some that all of us, a writer that all of us has grown up with. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite on stage the most beloved storyteller of our country. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Padma Shri and Padma Bhushan winner Ruskin Bond. Definitely best known for romantic stories, but his immense contribution to the Indian children literature is worth mentioning. So there we have Mr. Ruskin Bond with us, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. With him, I'm going to invite on stage the executive editor for Penguin Random House India, a music enthusiast, Mr. Premanka Goswami, to join us. Enjoy this session. I'm going to leave you to that. Over to you, Mr. Goswami.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be with Ruskin, one of the most loved and read authors of our times, with 70 years of writing innumerable fictions, essays, books for children and adults, as well as plenty of illustrated titles. May I request all of you to welcome Ruskin with a big round of applause, please.
Thank you.
So without taking much time, Ruskin, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please, fire away. Thank you, Premanka.
Yeah. So my first question is that, and it's largely for the audience, that you began writing pretty early in your life. So your first novel was out when you were 17, and you got John Lillian Rees Award much before you attained 30. So do you think that awards and awards really inspire and encourage authors and writers?
Thank you, Premanka. It's true, I did begin writing very early. And writing somehow wasn't very fashionable back in the 1950s when I finished school. Today I keep meeting youngsters and even oldsters who want to write, who are writing books. It seems to be the in thing. But when I finished school, 1950, you can see how ancient I am. Writing wasn't very popular as a profession. But I was determined to be a writer. And when I came home and my mother said, Ruskin, what are you going to do with yourself now? And I said, Mom, I think I'm going to be a writer. And she said, don't be silly, go and join the army. Now, in those days, almost every boy finishing school actually went into the army. But I was determined to be a writer, and although I was only 16, 17, I did get a few stories published in India, and then I sort of made my way to England and had my first novel published, The Room on the Roof, which Premanka just mentioned, and it did win a prize, but I was already back in India before the book had come out, because I wanted so much to come back. And so the award, the prize, did help me, but I don't think in the long run, prizes and awards have made much difference. If you're a good writer and you'll get a good readership, then prizes and awards along the way are nice to have, and nice to have them on your mantelpiece, but they're not going to do any great difference to your work.
So how did you become a writer?
How did I become a writer? There's only one way to become a writer, and that's to be a reader. I think if you look at the lives of all writers, most of those who are successful anyway, you'll find that when they were boys or girls, they were readers, they were bookworms. So it's from a love of reading that you come to a love of writing. And it was because I loved books as a boy, and still love them, that I wanted to, in a way, emulate my favorite authors. And not not copy them or write the same way, but to be a writer too, and to be a good one. Because to be a good writer is difficult at times.
So in most of your writings, you talk about discovering books. You talk about, especially about the school library in Shimla, in Bishop Cotton. So do you like to talk about the library?
Yes, a library is all important. And I'm glad to see that nowadays most of our schools in India, the better schools, all have good libraries. And the more enlightened principals and teachers encourage the children to read, even though they have a pretty heavy schedule as far as their work goes and their studies and their exams. But encouragement is being given to young writers, to young students, which is one reason why there are so many of them who are writing. And I keep meeting young people who are not just want to be writers, but who are actually writing books and stories and getting published. Sometimes they self-publish, but the fact is they want to write and they want to be published.
So in one of your essays, Adventures of a Book Lover, and I was going through it after a long time, and I quote, you write, "David Copperfield set me off on the road to literature. I identified with young David and wanted to grow up to be like him." So Dickens had a lasting influence on in your life and on your writing.
Very true, and there are sometimes special writers who have an influence on an author, and in my case, Dickens was the one who did, because when I was 12, when I read David Copperfield, which was the first Dickens novel that I read, I fell in love with the book, and young David in it, he grows up to be a writer. On the way, he also runs away from home. So I did both. I ran away from home, but not for long, because I didn't take enough pocket money. But I did grow up to be a writer. I couldn't be a great writer like Dickens, of course, but because I admired him so much, I wanted to be sort of going in his footsteps. And not just Dickens, but in that school library of which I remember I spent so much time, there were other writers who influenced me. Writers like J.B. Priestley, Somerset Maugham, Rabindranath Tagore, writers of the many writers of the 1940s and 50s, some of whom are still read, others maybe not. Others writers do get forgotten. Sometimes we think that writing a book gives us a sort of certain immortality. I assure you it doesn't. 99% of writers over the ages have been forgotten, even though some of them might have been very good. So writing is something you do anyway, regardless of whether it's going to make you rich or famous around the world or in your own country.
So I know that you write something almost every day. You tell me that when the days you write less, you write somewhere between 400 to 600 words. So would you talk about that, your writing ritual?
Yes, Premanka. I think most writers try to write something every day. You need a certain discipline in order to get through the assignment that you've been given, or to complete a novel, which can take a long time. Any book takes time to be completed. So you have to give it a certain amount of time every day. I try to write maybe a page or two every morning, but it's not compulsory. This morning I didn't write anything, but I will hopefully tomorrow morning. So I think you have to be pretty regular about it. And if you have a particular time of day that suits you, well then that's a good time to write. Different people have different times. And for me, early morning is probably the best.
So do you think that especially in this age of electronic media, internet, our reading habit has diminished to a large extent? Or was there a more vibrant reading habit when you were growing up?
Well, a lot of people complain, and parents complain too, that that children spend more time on the electronic media and don't read enough or read very little, and that is, of course, true to some extent. But you see, reading has always been a minority pastime. And even when I was a boy and in a class of 30 to 35 boys, there were just 2 or 3 of us who were really fond of reading and who read regularly and who read the books that they borrowed from the library. So, but then you see, at that time, education in India was confined to a few schools and maybe to the upper classes. I'm talking about education in English. So, but today it has spread very significantly and widely throughout the country, so that whereas you spoke in terms of hundreds of school boys and girls going to school in the 1940s and 50s, now it's hundreds of thousands and thousands. And even if only a small percentage of them are readers, in terms of actual numbers, they are hundreds of thousands, which is why books are being published, books are being bought, books are even being read. And that's why I'm sitting here with Premanka, my publisher, because we have an audience. Not all of you may be readers, but some of you are, and that the grand total of readers is quite significant.
So you talk about your parents who had a profound role in inculcating your reading habit, and you particularly talk about your father in your memoirs, in your autobiographies and autobiographical writings. Would you like to talk about them?
Yes, I was fortunate in that my father was a bookish man, so even when I was a small boy, he encouraged me to read. It's very important that parents encourage their children to read. And we lived here in New Delhi in the 1940s. This was during World War II, just 2 or 3 years before India's independence. And we lived in a small place on Atul Grove, which, to my surprise, is still there and totally unchanged, even though the rest of Delhi has changed. He would take me to bookshops and music shops, and it's very important, I think, that at least one parent encourages his or her children to read. And so that when I did go to a boarding school, I was already a reader, and the school library was just there waiting for me. So I'm grateful to my father for putting books my way at such an early age.
So in your writings and also in many interviews, you have said that Rusty is your alter ego. So Rusty is someone, as we see in the room on the roof, that he's searching for his identity. So do you think that while writing those various stories, you were also, able to come to terms with your identity, especially your Indian identity?
Yes, that's true, because I've always been a very personal writer. I've written out of my own life and as I get older, there's more to write about, in a way, because you have your whole life to look back upon. And The Room on the Roof was written when I was very young, when I was just 16, 17. And so I had the only experience I had to write about was my own. So I wrote out of my own life and about how I, as a boy, came to adjust to a different India, because I'd grown up as a small boy in what was then still British India, and now at the age of 12 or 13, I had to adjust to a new India and an independent India. And I think that's reflected in the book and in many of my early stories too.
So do you think that you found your voice pretty early in your life, and it's pretty consistent, that most of your writings are autobiographical in nature? Do you think that you are lucky?
Yes, there are two kinds of writers, the subjective and the objective. And the subjective writes out of his or her own life. And so it's been an interesting life, so I've not run out of material. Also, as I grew older and went to live in the hills for a great deal of my years, I became closer to nature and the natural world, the mountains, the rivers, the forests, the animals, all started playing a greater part in my writing and in my stories. So from being an autobiographical writer, I also became, in due course, a nature writer. So, and I think the two maybe have coalesced and become one. So I'm a autobiographical nature writer or a natural autobiographical writer.
So let us talk about some of your books which were adapted into movies, cinematic adaptation. Do you think that those adaptations or those appropriations were done in a way, and are you happy with them?
Films.
Films, yeah.
Yes, I've had 2 or 3 stories filmed, but they were never written with the intention that they should be filmed. I'm not a screenwriter or a script writer. That's a different discipline or genre altogether. But here, these were just stories that I wrote. Flight of Pigeons, which was a historical recreation, and that became the film Junoon, which was directed by Shyam Benegal, and it was an excellent film. Then The Blue Umbrella was a children's story which Vishal Bhardwaj adapted and made into an entertaining and touching film. And the last one was again a rather satirical story I wrote called Susanna's 7 Husbands, which became Saat Khoon Maaf, which had a mixed reception. But they were all interesting films, and you have to remember that the film is a different medium altogether from the novel or the short story. And so changes have to be made. Adaptations mean the story might be changed slightly, or the characters, in order to make an effective film, which is purely visual. And I think I was fortunate in that my stories fell into the hands of good directors, and the films, by and large, were worth seeing. And I'm not disappointed with them.
At one point, you were collecting a lot of records. I think you were very fond of Nellie Edson.
Yes. Again, it was my father who had this old gramophone, and we used to collect gramophone records. This is going back to the 1940s and 50s when the gramophone was popular, and from operatic singers like Caruso and Shaliappa, Nelson Eddy, to lighter singers, and even I remember to film music of the period of Noor Jahan and Rafi, and I had all these old records. Unfortunately, all gone now.
So among all the books that you wrote, which continues to be the most favorite one till date?
Oh, I don't have a favorite really. In some ways, The Room on the Roof, because it was my first, and it set me on the road to being a writer, which I've been now for nearly 70 years, which is probably a record of sorts. And so the first child is often the favorite child, so I still have a soft spot for The Room on the Roof. But every time I sit down to write a story or an essay or a poem, if I'm really enjoying it, then and at that moment, that's the favorite. That's the one I like the best. But later on, you can look back and have other favorites too.
So we have little more than 10 minutes now, and before we take questions from the audience, I have just one question for Ruskin. In the essay At Home in India, you wrote, "Race didn't make me an Indian. Religion didn't make me an Indian, but history did. And in the long run, it's history that counts."
That's right, and you see, India is such an amalgam of of people from different backgrounds, different languages. Just think of the 30 to 50 languages which have a rich culture and throughout the country. So language, ethnicity, religion, so many things come together. And it's all, they've come together over a period of time. So it's a historical, it's a historical creation. And my own parents were born in India. Of my 4 grandparents, 3 were born in India. So I think it would be impossible for me to claim citizenship of any other country. I can only be an Indian and nothing else.
Thank you, Ruskin. It was amazing. So we'll now take some questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please.
It's a nice sunny morning and the best time of the year in Delhi, I think. I lived here in Delhi in the 1960s. And it was very different then. It's certainly more interesting now. Something is happening all the time. Back in 1962, nothing happened.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, out of so many beautiful hill stations in India, why you decided to settle in Missouri?
Thank you. That's a good question. You see, I settled in Missouri because actually I grew up in Dehradun, which is at the bottom of the hill. And but I wanted to be closer to the mountains, the forests, and so I was always from childhood familiar with that area. So it was really home from the beginning, and also Missouri had a certain advantage in that it was closer to Delhi than other hill stations, and although I wanted to be on my own up in the hills, and I thought I'd write better there, but I still wanted to be in touch with publishers and editors. And Delhi, they were all in Delhi. And so it was easier to come down from Missouri. I could be here in a day, as I am here today, and I can be home tonight, actually, back in Missouri. So it's a very convenient hill station, apart from being in a beautiful part of Garhwal.
I think it's mutual. It's also great for publishers because they always have an excuse to visit Landor, reading, writing, editing, and bonding. We'll take another question, please. Yeah.
Well, yes, I invite you to come and open a branch office up in Missouri, right next to me.
Hello, sir. My question to you is how to counter writer's block.
Interesting that, every literary festival I've been to, or event, I'm always asked this question on writer's block. So it's something that seems to trouble writers or people who want to write, that you get sometimes you're stuck in the middle of an essay or a story or a book. And it does happen to writers that you might suddenly lose your enthusiasm for your theme, or something happens to prevent you from completing it. And I think the best thing is to, in a way, put it aside, do something else, and come back to it later. But if you've already written it in your head, and if it's, say, a short story, then you have done it actually visually. So it's a question of putting it down in words. So I would say before you sit down to write a story or an essay, write it in your head, see it happening as you would see a film, and then you'll find it's easier to just put it into words. And of course the final solution, if you can't go on or don't want to go on, keep a waste paper basket close to you and get rid of it. Words aren't sacred after all.
This lady behind, yeah.
Hello, sir. Can you please tell which book you are currently reading or which you read last?
What am I currently reading? Actually, I was reading 2 or 3 books. One on I was reading a book on the French Revolution. I was reading a biography of Chekhov, because I like reading biographies of other writers, famous ones. I was also reading a detective story. So usually I've got 2 or 3 books at hand. I dip into them by turn. Always reading something, though.
Yeah, this gentleman over there.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. Do you have any genre you would like to also write? Like any genre you missed that you could have write but you didn't write about?
Any genre that I would have liked to write about, but didn't write. Well, I've written children's books. I've written a bit of. I'd like to have perhaps written more with more history or stories with a historical background. Maybe a detective story, a good one. I did try once a detective story, but it didn't work out very well. Everybody, all the readers had guessed who the culprit or the murderer was after chapter 2. So, so I should give it another try, maybe. There's always something that we haven't done that we should try to do. I agree.
Yeah, so lady.
So, is fame a curse or a blessing for a writer?
Is fame a curse or a blessing for a writer? Now that's a very profound question, because sometimes too much fame can distract you from your writing, and because writing is, after all, it's a lonely, personal art. When you write, you go into your study, you sit at your table or desk in your own room, you don't have an audience. You're writing in a way for yourself or for an imaginary reader. You're not performing in public, you see. So it's in a way, a very private sort of performance. And if you're suddenly catapulted into fame and to having to deal with hundreds of thousands of readers or fans and followers, it can sort of maybe make you take the wrong step or start writing maybe just to be popular. So it has its disadvantages. At the same time, well, we all want recognition too, if you take the trouble to write a book or a novel. So one needs recognition and a certain amount of success, but I agree, too much of it can be detrimental.
We'll take one more question, last question.
Thank you. Those are very nice questions. I enjoyed answering them.
Hello. Sir, I read many of your short stories and I really love them. I could feel the images that you are trying to portray. I'd just like to ask this question that whenever you're writing, I could feel you on a personal level. Did you easily come to terms with accepting yourself the way you are? Because I think that you're a very unique person and romantic. And you see the world in a different way, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you. I think that goes back to one's childhood and boyhood. I think by the time we are 11 or 12 years old, we are perhaps set in your ways, and in our ways. And I did have, to begin with, a lonely childhood, and perhaps that comes through. Our personalities are formed at an early age, and writers in particular. And I do put myself into my work, that's true. Sometimes I'm criticized for doing that, in that I'm perhaps there's too much of myself in them. But then different writers have different ways of expressing themselves, and I find it easier to write in a personal way, because I can then even write about other people with a little more sympathy and affection than I would if I had distanced myself from them.
We have time for one more question.
Hope that helps.
Just one question. This lady behind. Yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm in 8th grade and I'm kind of interested in writing. But as you said, a good writer should be a good reader. But I am not able to read novels, but I'm able to read short stories. So how should I inculcate my interest in reading
read
books?
Read what you enjoy reading. Don't force yourself. If you're not fond of novels, don't force yourself to read them. Read short stories. You can improve your writing by reading good literature. And good literature includes not just novels, it includes short stories, it includes biographies, it includes essays, poetry. There's so many genres. So read the ones you enjoy. I won't force myself to read a book just because everybody else is reading it. You will, in fact, destroy your interest in writing if you force yourself into reading the things you don't enjoy. So read for enjoyment, but read. That's the important thing.
Thank you so much, Ruskin. It was a great, great afternoon.
Thank you, Premanka, for all your good questions and the good questions from the audience. Thank you.
Ruskin Bond, A Life in Literature. Please give him a warm round of applause. Thank you. Thank you, Ruskin.